The Western effort to stop Putin, which was once highly ambitious and aggressive, is now rapidly losing momentum. Western countries, especially the US and Europe, are no longer as committed or capable of sustaining their campaign against Russia. Whether through military aid to Ukraine, or sanctions, or diplomatic pressure. And Zelensky, his diplomatic sparkle has worn off. And now, with Trump back in the White House, and Washington negotiating with Moscow behind closed doors, without Ukraine, Putin might just walk away with everything he wanted, like blocking Ukraine from NATO, a divided and weakened Ukraine, and sanctions relief. And his only real setback? NATO expanded, with Finland and Sweden joining the club. And what about Ukraine? Well, Trump's Ukraine peace plan isn't exactly about peace, it's more like a business deal wrapped in diplomacy. His offer: the US will help Ukraine, but only if Kyiv hands over 50% of its revenue from natural resources, including minerals, oil, and ports. Sounds like a generous ally, right? But that's not all. In mid-February 2025, President Donald Trump escalated his criticism of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky amid mounting frustration over the ongoing war. On February 18, Trump labeled Zelensky grossly incompetent and even seemed to blame Ukraine for the war Russia started. Zelensky hit back, accusing Trump of being surrounded by misinformation. Then, Trump doubled down, calling Zelensky a dictator without elections, while repeating his claim that the US has pumped billions into Ukraine, and half of it has gone missing. Clearly, Trump is signaling a shift away from unconditional US support for both Ukraine and Europe. Remember when Western leaders, analysts, and media called Putin a madman who miscalculated by invading Ukraine? They said Russia's economy would collapse. They said Ukraine would drive Russia out. Well, look where they are now. Putin isn't losing, he's outlasting. Because he learned from 2014, when Russia took Crimea, Putin realized three things. The West talks tough, but avoids direct confrontation. Russia needed to be sanctions-proof. And the West will never be as patient as he is. And now, that patience is paying off. But what about the West? Back in 2014, they saw Crimea's annexation as a direct challenge to their influence. The Ukrainian revolution was fueled by domestic unrest, but let's be honest, Western powers backed it. The result? The ousting of a pro-Russian president, and the start of a full-blown geopolitical showdown. Ukraine had been pushing for NATO membership since the early 2000s, but under Zelensky, the push became urgent. This, in turn, set the stage for escalating tensions with Moscow. The conflict ultimately positioned Russia and NATO in direct opposition, reinforcing NATO's influence in the region. And now, here they are. 3 years of war, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. And Europe waking up to a terrifying reality. Something big is shifting, and fast. The security shield it relied on for nearly 80 years. Cracking. NATO kept the continent safe under American leadership, but that guarantee fading. NATO's future uncertain. And now, Europe is scrambling to figure out how to defend itself alone. Friedrich Merz, Germany's likely next leader, openly questioned whether NATO would even exist in its current form by June, and called for an independent European defense strategy, one that doesn't rely on America. And he's not alone. Across the continent, leaders are waking up to a hard truth. America might not be there to back him up anymore. Trump has made it clear. Europe's security is no longer Washington's priority. And the shockwaves are already spreading. Just look at the latest UN vote. The US sided with Russia, blocking a resolution from its own European allies that blamed Russia for the Ukraine war. Instead, Washington pushed its own resolution, calling for a swift end to the war, without reaffirming Ukraine's territorial integrity. So what's Europe's plan? Right now, leaders like Macron and Britain's Starmer are discussing deploying troops to Ukraine, not to fight, but to secure key infrastructure like cities, ports, and nuclear power plants. But even that exposes major weaknesses. European forces are already stretched thin. Many nations would struggle to send even a single combat-ready brigade. And a deployment to Ukraine would leave serious gaps in NATO's defenses back home. And that's just the beginning of their problems. Here's the bigger issue. Europe still relies heavily on the US for critical military support, intelligence, logistics, even command structures. It's all deeply tied to Washington. Even if Europe boosts defense spending, turning cash into combat-ready forces isn't easy. France, for example, has promised to raise its military budget, but that alone won't fix the problem. For reference, only 23 out of 32 NATO countries even hit the 2% spending target today. And building the necessary armored brigades, producing enough munitions, and training soldiers. That takes years. Then there's firepower. Europe has impressive fighter jets, but guess what? They lack the munitions to take on a major power like Russia. Most advanced missile stockpiles. Made in America. Europe's defense industry is growing fast. Since 2022, European NATO states have bought over 50% of their new weapons from within Europe, reducing reliance on American suppliers. But for key systems, like rocket artillery, long-range air defenses, stealth aircraft, Europe still needs US technology. While Europe is ramping up production, it's still nowhere near enough. That's why European countries have turned to South Korea, Brazil, and even Israel for weapons. And the biggest problem of all: nuclear weapons. For 80 years, Europe has lived under the US nuclear umbrella. If that goes away, Britain and France are the only nuclear-armed European powers left. But their arsenals combined barely compare to Russia's. Germany's Friedrich Merz is now pushing for nuclear talks with Britain and France. But can they replace the US? Not really. France and the United Kingdom collectively have around 515 nuclear warheads, while Russia has over 1,700 deployed strategic warheads. Building a true European nuclear deterrent would take years, and a whole lot of money. And Britain's entire deterrent relies on US missiles. So even if Europe wanted nuclear independence, it wouldn't be easy. So where does that leave Europe? Scrambling to rearm, questioning NATO's future, and wondering if the US is still on their side. Now the big question is, can Europe survive without America? Is this the beginning of a new, independent Europe? Or is this the beginning of NATO's end? Or the start of an era of instability? If Europe doesn't act fast, it may find itself defenseless. And in just a few months, we may have our answer.